School of Psychology at Queen's University Belfast online research seminar for this year. So we're really pleased to be able to kick off our virtual seminar series with a talk by Dr. Kathleen Corriveau. Dr. Corriveau is an associate professor at Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development, and there she directs the Social Learning Laboratory. Dr. Corriveau is an award-winning researcher and a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, and she focuses largely on social cognitive development of trust in early childhood. So her research bridges ideas from developmental psychology and social psychology and applies them to educational settings. Today, Dr. Corriveau will present a line of research focusing on how young children develop religious and science cognition, given that these are domains where children cannot learn all the concepts through firsthand experimentation alone. And so this research program was very excitingly recently funded by a $10 million grant from the Temple Foundation to Dr. Corriveau and colleague Dr. Rebecca Reichert. And this funding will go to create an international collaborative developing belief network studying the development of religious acquisition across 24 sites of the world. So we're really excited that Dr. Corriveau is here today to tell us a little bit more about this program of research. So I'll turn it over to you now to discuss your research on the role of adult testimony in children's conceptualization of the invisible and the impossible.
Thanks, Jocelyn. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I'm excited to share with you all some of the work that we've been doing, as Jocelyn mentioned. I'm just going to start sharing my screen and tell me if you can see. Hold on. This apparently is a multi-step process for me.
We can see your screen.
Oh, you can?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So as Jocelyn mentioned, I'm really excited to share some of the work that we've been doing exploring how children make ontological judgments in the domains of religion and science. And as Jocelyn alluded to, the large question that our lab has been working on for many years now is this question about how young children make decisions about learning in the world. So if you take this child here, and for example, if he wanted to learn about the relation between volume and weight, he has access to two primary sources of information. On the one hand, he could learn from a teacher, and this teacher might give him an equation that helps him to understand the relation between volume and weight. But on the other hand, he could go with his firsthand experience. And for example, he might get access to a set of scales and over time understand the relation between these concepts. Now, intuitively, you might think that this second strategy is the best strategy, learning by your own experience. And in fact, there's a rich history in philosophy and psychology exploring these concepts, starting with the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said that children don't truly learn when other people answer their questions. And this notion has also been taken up in developmental psychology, starting with Jean Piaget, who highlighted this and said that knowledge is derived by action and interaction in the world. And similarly, more contemporary psychologists, Alison Gopnik and Andy Meltzoff, took this one step further and said that knowledge is not just derived by action and interaction, but children actually learn just like scientists learn. So they experiment in the world, they come up with a theory and a hypothesis, and then modify that through their own interaction. And this concept has also been taken up in education. So here's a quote by Eleanor Duckworth, highlighting the fact that telling students what we want them to know is not necessarily the best strategy. However, if you go back to this kid and take this question quite literally and think about how a young child might learn something like the shape of the earth, if you go with the strategy just based on the child's own firsthand experience, he may come up with a solution that perhaps is not accurate. And in fact, learning about something like the shape of the earth might be a more efficient strategy if the child turns to a teacher. And this is the case in a fair number of domains where children are learning from others. So I showed you the shape of the earth and science in general, but the same is true in terms of religion, because the entire basis of religion is based on faith. Moreover, history, we can't go back in time, so we have to rely on the information provided by others. Social and moral conventions like stealing. Language. So this is my oldest daughter learning language by reading the Handbook of Child Language Acquisition. And I would argue that this perhaps is not the most efficient strategy. It's more efficient for her to be learning from others. And even arbitrary facts. So this is the mascot at Boston University. And I could tell you that his name is actually Rhett. And the reason why his name is Rhett is because our team colors are scarlet, and nobody loves scarlet more than Rhett. But the important point here is, in order to believe that fact, you have to turn to me as a trusted source of information in this particular domain. And if Jocelyn had introduced me as a professor from a different university, I may not be a trusted source. And so the information that young children are learning from others in these and other domains, we have been calling testimony. And philosophers have called that for many years. And what we're arguing is that the testimony that young children are exposed to by caregivers and teachers influences their understanding in these domains and is an important source of information for young learners. So as Jocelyn mentioned, what I'm hoping to share with you today is actually how children learn about things that they can't see for themselves. And I became interested in this topic based on, again, my longstanding interest in how children make judgments based on the testimony they hear from others. And when you think about things that children can't see for themselves, this is particularly interesting because the only source of information that they have for things that they can't see for themselves is the testimony of others. And so the child might think about using two separate strategies to make these judgments. On the one hand, they could take an empirical stance and say that the only thing that exists is things that I've observed or could observe. And so they can observe butterflies, but they can't observe germs and God and unicorns. And so perhaps the ontological distinction is here in terms of what they can see and what they can't see. Alternatively, they could take a strategy based on testimony and think about what exists is what I've been told about. And there, you might think that the boundary might move here. And so they might have been told about the existence of germs and God and butterflies, but less so about unicorns. And so that's the way they're thinking about these categories. Oh, and so here's endorsed versus unendorsed testimony that they might see. And again, today I'm going to focus on these categories, science and religion. And the data that I'm going to be showing you today are based on a Templeton grant that we received a few years ago with my collaborators, Paul Harris, as well as several graduate students and postdocs, Jen Clegg, Aisha Payer, Telly Devuti, Kelly Tway, Neem McLaughlin, and Eleanor Fang. And as Jocelyn mentioned, I do want to highlight the fact that we're extending this work through the Developing Belief Network that Queen's University Belfast is a part of, and we're very excited to think about this together. And there is some evidence that children do attend to testimony when thinking about things that they can't see for themselves. So this is some earlier work by Paul Harris and others, looking at how children think about endorsed entities like the tooth fairy, scientific entities like germs, and equivocal entities like mermaids. And what you see here is that the way that children conceptualize the tooth fairy and germs, where the testimony is endorsed, is qualitatively different than the way that they're thinking about mermaids. And they justify their responses by appealing to the same types of evidence. They largely elaborate on their responses when talking about endorsed entities, whereas they focus on firsthand experience when they're thinking about equivocal entities. We also know from some work by Andrew Stuhlman and Susan Carey that children also use their developing understanding of causality to make inferences about the likelihood that something could have occurred. So here's some data thinking about whether or not you could have an alligator under your bed or eat lightning for breakfast. And children's understanding about these improbable events versus impossible and ordinary events develops over age, with age. And some of my own work has highlighted the fact that older but not young children are able to categorize story characters in narratives that they've never heard before. And the way that they justify these judgments appeals to their understanding of causal violations. So we looked at their justifications highlighting the impossible or the realistic information. And what we see here, this is the data from 3-year-olds showing that for the most part, children aren't really attending to anything, or their judgments are largely based on unrelated things. But by 5 to 7, what you see is that when they're appealing to fictional stories, they're highlighting the violations, the impossible nature of the narrative, whereas when they're talking about historical narratives, they're highlighting what's real about the narrative. And so taken together, these data indicate that children do appear to attend to the testimony of the community when determining whether entities and events are real. And they're also using their developing understanding of causality when making inferences about what could be possible. And the data that I just showed you indicate that the justifications that children use echo children's use of causality. They're justifying historical stories by attending to the realistic aspects, stories by to the fantastical element. So this brings us to an interesting puzzle, which is what about religious narratives? Given that religious narratives and religious entities are endorsed by adults through testimony, but they also contain elements of violations of causality. So here we see divine intervention or being raised from the dead. How do children view those? Are they viewing them as real or pretend? So on the one hand, they may view these things as pretend. And we know that the data that I just showed you, that the way that children are doing this is protagonists in stories that include these violations of causality are likely to be pretend. And the data that I showed you from Andrew Stuhlman and Susan Carey indicate that events that include causal violations are likely to be impossible. But there's also some data that indicate that entities might be real under special circumstances. So when you include a magical element, that could be real, and magic could be the causal mechanism. And there's some data from Rebecca Reichert and colleagues indicating that God has some special powers. And that some data from Jackie Woolley and colleagues that children do believe that familiar religious miracles could have happened. And some of our data indicate that not only are children attending to causal violations when they're making these judgments, but they're also impacted by the culture in which they are exposed. So children's belief in the existence of unobservable religious entities might vary based on the quality of the testimony from the surrounding community. So here's some data where we gave children not only realistic and fantastical narratives, but also religious narratives. Unsurprisingly, here, I'll just give you that again. All children, regardless of exposure to church, viewed religious narratives as real. Again, unsurprisingly, exposure to religion impacted the way that they viewed religious categories. But what I want to highlight to you here is that these ontological judgments were extended to a third category, these fantastical entities. And children exposed to religion were significantly more likely to believe that fantastical narratives could be real. So to explore how cultural exposure might have impacted the way that children make these ontological judgments about invisible scientific or religious entities, we collected data from children growing up in 3 societies, the US, China, and Iran. And here's a map of an index based on the population of atheists in the world, with darker numbers showing higher percentage of atheists and lighter numbers showing low percentages. And so what you see here is that we have a relatively pluralistic country like the US, whereas more homogenous countries like China and Iran. And as I said, this is part of a larger grant. I'm going to show you two parts of the data today, looking at the existence of unobservable religious and scientific entities, as well as the role of testimony in children's judgments. But we also have a whole second set of studies looking at children's judgments about possibility as well. So I'm going to start here, really focusing on judgments about the existence of unobservables. And I'm going to think about how children would resolve the conflicts if their testimony provided by adults and the immediate community is different from the broader society. And so we thought about this in two different ways. First, as mentioned before, the US is more pluralistic than Iran and China. But within Iran and China, there might be children who receive different testimony from the community. For example, children in China who receive religious testimony, but explicit instruction about a religion as a superstitious subject in school. And so I'm going to show you two different ways of looking at these data. The first one is just looking at the religious children within each of these societies and exploring how they're making these ontological judgments about unobservable entities and how they're justifying the way that they're making these judgments. And then the second way is by looking at the relation between the parental beliefs and children's beliefs in China, as well as in the US, in secular and religious households. And just to show you that our intuitions about how religiosity, the way that adults are thinking about scientific and religious entities, I'm going to show you some data exploring the valuation of religion and science. And here we measured religiosity using two items that capture the public and private practice of religion, an additional item that captured self-assessed religiosity. And we asked parents to indicate how frequently they attended religious services, how frequently they privately worshiped, and whether they self-identified as a religious person. And then we asked them to think about the extent to which they agreed with these valuations of religious and science scales. And here on the x-axis, we're looking at the religiosity of the parents, as well as how much they value religion. Unsurprisingly, we see a strong positive relation in all these three countries between religiosity and the valuation of religion. But interestingly to us, here we're now looking at the valuation of science and religiosity. We see variability across these three countries. Whereas in Iran, adults are perfectly happy to view these concepts as coexisting in terms of what they value. There's a strong negative relation in the US. And I love data like this because it's really highlighting how strange the US is as compared to other countries. And then to show you the types of entities that we asked children and adults about, these are 4 different types of categories. So here's the high consensus religious entities. This is looking at relative clustering in terms of different factors. Here's the high consensus scientific entities. These are the low consensus scientific entities, and here's the low consensus religious entities. Today, I'm going to talk with you only about these high consensus religious entities. But again, just to show you the relative consistency about the way that adults are thinking about these, here's some data from adults in both the US and China, seeing a strong positive relation between their existence judgments and religiosity in terms of high consensus religious entities, no relation in terms of high consensus scientific entities. And again, relative similarity here in terms of the way that they're viewing low consensus scientific entities. So as I mentioned, the first thing I'm going to show you today is how religious children growing up in these 3 societies are making these ontological judgments. So we have data from the US, data from Iran and data from China. And what you'll see here is that we have a relatively wide age range, 5 to 11 years old. And this allows us to look at the relative impact of schooling on children's judgments. So we divided these children into a younger age group that has relatively low impact of school, so 5 to 7-year-olds, as well as an older age group, 9 to 11-year-olds. And we focused on these high consensus religious and scientific entities. So God, heaven, and angels, and germs, oxygen, and electricity. And we asked children 2 different forced choice questions. Do you think this entity exists or doesn't exist? And then, how sure are you? And then we asked, so the how sure you are you was, you said it was real or not real, how sure are you, very sure or not sure? And because these were categorical questions, we were able to group the responses into 4 different categories. Very sure about the existence, not very sure about the existence, not very sure about the non-existence, and very sure about the non-existence. And we asked children to justify their responses as well. So why do you think it is that God exists or doesn't exist? So I'm first going to show you judgments of the religious entities. And what you're seeing here on the y-axis is the percentage of responses falling into each of the categories. And as I said, we divided children into a younger group, children with little exposure to formal schooling, and an older group. And this is a mixed effects ordinal logistic regression. And what you can see is surprising similarity across our 3 countries. So most religious children were very sure that the entities existed. And as I said, we also asked children to justify their responses. And we've divided children's justifications into 4 separate categories. So uninformative, whether or not they've encountered it. So this is kind of a firsthand experience question. Source, my mom's told me about it, it's in the Bible, I've read about it, and this is really focusing on testimony. And then elaboration. And so this is just talking about more information about that entity. And these categories were mutually exclusive. So it's plausible that a child could have used multiple justifications to justify the existence or non-existence of a particular entity. So here we have the percentage of justifications on the y-axis. And on the x-axis are the countries. And I'm just going to show you the 3 justification types, excluding the uninformative. So what you'll see here is a minority of children produce, a minority of children produce those uninformative judgments. And here, what you're seeing is that there's a significant 3-way age by country, by justification type interaction. And really, the difference is between China and everybody else, where in the US and Iran, the primary strategy to justify their judgments is based on elaboration. But in China, these children are increasingly noticing the importance of justifying their judgments based on the source of their knowledge. And we think this is likely because these children are growing up in a society where they are the minority. And so it's very important for them to really highlight the importance of testimony, specifically from their parents, when they're making these judgments. And then just to confirm that these differences in justification were constrained to the domain in which testimony was varying, I'm going to very quickly walk you through the scientific entities. So basically, you're seeing really no effect of anything in terms of country. Everybody's really sure that scientific unobservables are real. And they're all justifying their choices by focusing on elaboration. Here, again, you're not seeing this strong effective source, whereas we saw that before. And this indicates that children's focus on source in China isn't a global strategy, it's constrained to religion. And again, this is because in China, Chinese Christian children are growing up in a society where their beliefs are not held by the larger community. I'm going to zoom in on China here, really focusing on the fact if the findings that I just showed you are holding, the mechanism that we're arguing for. And so we should see a strong relation between parental beliefs and their own children's beliefs in terms of the ontology of these entities. And so to do that, we looked at parent-child ontological judgments in children that were identified as secular versus children who identified as Christian. And again, because we were looking at the role of formal schooling, we divided these children into a younger and an older age group. We looked at the same 6 entities again, religious and scientific, high consensus entities. And we had parents and children rate the existence of them. For parents, this was a scale looking at the most possible existence to the least possible existence. And then for children, we asked 2 separate forced choice questions. Like the same questions again, is it real or not real? How sure are you? We divided them up into the same 4 categories. Here's the results from the parents. The x-axis is scientific and religious, and here we're looking at the judgment of unobservables. 7 is they believe it exists. 1 is they're sure that it doesn't exist. And unsurprisingly, what we're seeing is strong consensus in terms of the existence of scientific entities and a huge distinction in terms of the existence of religious entities depending on family religiosity. And that's a significant interaction. For children, before we asked children about the entity and asked whether or not it exists, we actually asked if they had ever heard of it before, because it makes really no sense to ask them about what they think about something if they've never heard of it. And so what I'm showing you here is the extent to which children had heard of 0 through 3 items in terms of religious and scientific. And what you see here is for scientific, most children had heard about the 3 entities that we talked about. By contrast, we're seeing a large difference in the extent to which they had heard about religious entities. 9 to 11-year-old children had mostly heard about them, but there's a wide range of variability in the extent to which young children were exposed to these religious entities. And this really highlights the paucity of testimony about these key Christian concepts that's available to young children and the larger secular community in mainland China. And this is a significant difference. So here I'm showing you the data from children. They're divided up into younger and older, secular and Christian. And I'm showing you the scientific and the religious entities. What you see here for the scientific entities, similar to the data that I showed you before, all children about the existence of scientific entities. And by contrast, we see a difference in terms of their certainty about religious entities. Christian children are very sure that these entities exist. By contrast, secular children are viewing these as more variable. However, we were really interested in the relation, again, between the way that parents are thinking about these and the way that children are thinking about these. So here we're plotting parents' existence judgments on the x-axis and children's existence judgments on the y-axis. And I'm showing you data only from the religious domain, because in the scientific domain, as you saw, all parents and children were really at ceiling in terms of. And so here's the data, but dividing children and parents up into Christian families and secular families. And what you see here is a strong positive relation between the existence judgments of parents and their own children in Christian families, Chinese Christian families. And by contrast, you don't see the same effect in Chinese secular families. And again, this makes sense because these Chinese Christian families are part of a religious minority. And so there, the quality of the testimony by their own parent might be incredibly important as children are making distinctions about what's real and what's not real. I did want to highlight that we're finding the same result in the US, that parents' existence ratings is strongly related to their own children's existence ratings in a more pluralistic society where there are secular and religious families. So I did want to turn to why we're seeing that. And as I've been arguing, we believe that the reason why we're seeing these strong relations between what children are believing and what parents are believing is based on the quality of the parental testimony as a mechanism for the transmission of this. And to explore this, what we had parents and children do is engage in conversation about the existence of these entities. So we handed parents different cards where these words were written. We said, here's 18 cards, please take out all of them and shuffle them. And we asked them, they were randomly ordered. And we said, we're most interested in how you typically talk with your child. There's no right or wrong answers. Some of the entities, parents looked at this and said, nope, I'm not going to talk about that. That was actually really interesting data to us. And so we were interested in the quality of the talk that parents were providing to young children. We also coded children's talk, but really what we found is that when we coded for the type of conversations and interaction that they were having, these conversations were really parents. We felt like this was a good way to think about this. And in particular, we were interested in the extent to which parents were including these cues to uncertainty when they're talking about the entities. So think and believe and wonder, maybe. So these are things, if you think about this intuitively, you might say, well, maybe God exists, but it's going to be relatively unusual for an adult in the society to say something like, well, maybe germs exist. And we were also interested in variation in belief. So the extent to which parents are noting the fact that although some people believe something, not all people might believe it. And what you're seeing here, I'm going to just show you the data from the modulations of assertion. So again, these are think and believe and maybe. What you're seeing is that parents are using them much more when they're talking about religious high consensus entities than when they're talking about germs and oxygen and electricity. Although again, this isn't zero, they are doing it sometimes. And the extent to which they're using these modulations is related to their religiosity. So here we're looking at data, looking at parents' own religiosity on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the number of modulations of assertion. And for parents that are not religious, they really vary in the extent to which they're using these to mark the testimony with which these entities are discussed. By contrast, for highly religious parents, there are less modulations used. And this makes qualitative sense if you think about it, because if you believe in the existence both of God and germs, then you don't need to mark the testimony by including these modifiers because everything's real. And again, we believe that this type of testimony is then impacting the way that children are viewing these categories. We also see the same effect in terms of explicitly mentioning reality status. So adults are more likely to mark the reality status of entities, so saying God is real, whereas they hardly ever are saying things like germs are real, which again, totally makes sense. And they're also engaging in more elaborations. So they're more likely, oh, sorry, here we're not seeing variability in terms of the extent to which they're engaging in elaborations. The only one that we're not seeing that parents are elaborating on is really heaven. And that makes sense because heaven really isn't a causal agent. And just to show you qualitatively what some of this testimony looks like. So this is a family who is not religious. And what you're seeing here is you're seeing the causal agency of God. God makes things happen. He made this big storm happen. He wanted to make a big flood. Some people believe, again, highlighting the variation in belief. And mommy and daddy have a tendency not so much to believe in God. So again, so here they're marking these modulations about belief, as well as talking about the variation in belief. And this doesn't happen for families where the family is more highly religious. So here they're really just focusing on their causal agent elaboration, and not really focusing on the variation in belief. He takes care of us. He gives us faith. Faith, again, causal agent. He created, he died, he gave us faith, and that's that. So again, not acknowledging that there's a possibility that other people are believing different things. It's just, these are the facts. And we have run that same model, looking at the relation between children's judgments and these cues, and we see the same finding, that the inclusion of these cues, and particularly these modulations of assertion, are strongly related to children's own belief in the existence of these entities. Indicating for us that really the way that young children are making decisions about them is based on the quality of the testimony to which they're exposed. So in summary then, what I hope I've shown you is that there appears to be variability in the quality of the testimony that young children are exposed to. We're seeing more modulations based on the family religiosity. We're seeing variation in belief, and they're more likely to mention these reality statuses. But that's not the case for all things. They were equally likely to talk about the causal agency of the religious and scientific phenomenon. And we do think that this is the mechanism through which young children are making these judgments. So taken together then, what I hope I've shown you is that the way that young children are learning about things that they can't see for themselves is through the quality of the testimony. And this testimony, they're also sensitive to the cultural environment in which they're embedded. So when there's a conflict between the testimony that they're receiving from parents in the community, they're more likely to justify their choices by appealing to sources. And we saw that in particular looking at the children growing up in China that were members of a religious household, as opposed to children growing up in Iran in the US. We see a strong relation between the way that parents are thinking about the existence of these entities and the way that children are thinking about the existence of these entities. And so by implication, we argued that parental testimony should match children's judgments. And in fact, that seems to be what we're finding. In particular, these modulations of assertion maybe, I think, seem to be impacting the way that young children are thinking about them. They're marking that as possibly not universal. And the other thing that this highlights for us is the importance of exploring both between cultural and within cultural variability in religious cognition, which brings us again to this new network that we've started with my colleague Rebecca Rickert, as well as multiple collaborators, including QUB, focusing on how young children are thinking about belief based on community and cultural exposure, as well as the type of testimony that they're hearing. I just want to thank the lab as my funders, and I'll be happy to chat with you more through questions.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Thank you. Especially, I should note, it's still very early in the morning in the United States. So thank you for both getting up early and joining us remotely. I know most of us would, in other times, be having a cup of tea and a snack during this time all together. So we really appreciate you joining us remotely and giving us this really interesting talk. And yes, we would love to open it up now for questions, both on Kathleen's talk and also just to note that some of these research questions will start being asked in Northern Ireland. So if anyone has ideas about how to ask these types of questions in this culture, that would be really interesting to hear as well.
Should I stop sharing my slides, Jocelyn?
Yes, probably. You can always reshare if someone wants to go back to a slide. And if everyone wants to put on videos so we can see your faces, and I will set it so that people can chime in. Hold on. Okay, so I believe you should be able to speak now. Does anyone brave want to give it a try? That's not a good sign. Oh.
Sorry, can you see? I can't tell if you can see it, so I raised my hand literally, but I can also do it with this if you can hear me.
Yes, I can see hands raising and we can hear you, Laura. Fantastic.
Okay, sorry. So much. I love these talks because I worked a lot with kids, and now having my own, I'm like, I hear this, I'm like, oh my gosh, do I use those words? Do I talk? You know, I'm very analytical as well. But there's something that came up yesterday for us is something like a panda, right? Which is real, but my child will never see because of the type of zoo we have access to. So I was just wondering about these types of categories. So both things like when you're talking about mermaids and other things and unicorns, like again, if you look on t-shirts, there's unicorns all over. So what about these in-between ones where kids might see loads of images of them, but how do they differentiate between a unicorn and something like a panda, which is rare in that way? But I know, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. This highlights the fact that not only are children using their own firsthand experience, as well as the presence of artifacts in their society, as well, in addition to testimony. And so what we would argue is when you talk with your child about a panda, you're going to say, well, you can see a panda if you ever go to Asia, and you can also, but again, you're not going to use these modulations. Like, I think pandas are real. You're not going to say that because in your household, pandas are something that is just marked as real. Similarly, in my household, the tooth fairy still comes and visits. And when we talk about the tooth fairy's visit, we also talk about how she came and this is what she left. And we're not, again, marking that as something where there's variability in belief.
Thanks, Laura. I'll just go with the hands I can see here, but feel free to keep picking up your hands and I will keep calling on people. So John?
Thanks, Jocelyn, and thanks very much for the talk, Kathleen. I really enjoyed that. I mean, my own work in this area has been more focused on sort of behavioral socialization from parents than verbal, but it was really good to hear about what you're mentioning here about the quality of testimony and this sort of these different cues. That's really interesting. Suppose my question stems back to a really long-standing debate about what are religious beliefs. So coming in from the anthropological tradition, early on in sort of Victorian era anthropology, religious beliefs were hypotheses, right? Sort of similar to scientific hypotheses about the world and how it works. And then you had this sort of Durkheimian sociological tradition come in that said, actually, kind of what religious beliefs are, what they're about, is sort of symbolic statements of society. So you're indicating group membership, and the religious ideas are symbols for a society that existed before us, outlives us, and is bigger than us in some way, and we have trouble sort of comprehending that. And in a lot of research now in CSR, I mean, depending on, the different schools of thought, I think a lot of folks do use the idea of supernatural agent beliefs as types of hypotheses, and that seems to be what you're going for here. What I'm wondering, though, is, I mean, I don't know if you've come across Neil Van Leeuwen's work. He looks at cognitive distinction between what he calls religious credence and factual beliefs. So credence is factual beliefs. That doesn't mean religious or false. It just means that they're held cognitively differently. They're held as identity badge markers rather than just as a claim about the way that the world works that has no or very little interaction to who we are as people. So I think there's something to that idea of these beliefs standing in or having something to do with coalitions we're a part of or groups we're members of, rather than just claims about the world. So I wonder if you've looked at that within your studies. So like if you're asking kids, are these real or not? If you have some conditions where you can prime coalitionary membership or threat or whatever it is that would get them thinking more along lines of establishing affiliation with a parent or establishing affiliation with a wider society, can these can you get differential endorsement, and might that be indicative that coalitional psychology, as much as explanatory psychology, is involved?
Well, that's really interesting. I would anticipate that you're absolutely right. We haven't done it when looking at religious identity or religious beliefs, but we have with racial identity. So this was a different study that we did with biracial children, and we were able to prime their racial identity in terms of whether or not it was minoritized or white. And there we did see differences, specifically when children were primed with their minoritized identity. They were much more willing to kind of think about these more coalitionist beliefs than when they were primed with their majority identity. And so I would imagine that we'd see kind of two things: the extent to which really focusing on your religious social group has important social value. So perhaps in Northern Ireland, this would be a really interesting place where religion really does have important value. Whereas in Boston, it doesn't matter nearly to the same extent. But that's a great idea. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Yeah, thank you, Don. That was really interesting. And just to quickly follow up, I think you could think about the same types of ideas in how parents talk about social groups as well. So do parents talk about social groups as being real entities or not? So we might see some of the same variation in language there that could be primed, or I think that would be really interesting as well. And looking at communities where religious groups are incredibly important. Laura, is your hand still up, or is it up again?
No, I couldn't take it down. I think every time I clicked on it, I was making it worse. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Any other questions?
My hand will go back up then. Sorry, I'm like that person. And no, I was just thinking about our context. And so Kathleen, as well as you were kind of mentioning, so time in school. So for us, time in school, which does have mandatory religious education, even in the integrated schools, might we see like a convergence of that with age? Do you know, would you expect, you know, if you would just even speak off the cuff, or for other colleagues from Northern Ireland as well, do you know, might that converge with scientific beliefs? Would it follow a similar pattern if they are talking about it in schools, in addition to in the home?
I can't talk about Northern Ireland, and I would love to hear your intuitions, but I can talk about China, where the school-based system is extremely, it's government mandated, and the way that they talk about religion is the same way that they talk about superstitions, and it's very explicitly marked as not real. And so we actually, that was part of the reason why we divided these children into this age group where they hadn't been exposed to a lot of schooling and then they had. And what we found in China is that even these older children that had been in school for a long time had been exposed to this doctrine that these things are not real, that never impacted the way that they themselves viewed these entities when we asked them about them in, again, a safe space that was not associated with school. The other thing that I should have mentioned about China is that it's actually might not have been the safest thing for us to even do this work. It's relatively not allowed to talk about religious beliefs outside of the comfort of their own home, and so these participants felt really safe sharing this stuff with us, and that was really helpful. But again, it never impacted the way that they themselves thought about them. And again, this was associated with the way that they marked these beliefs, focusing on the source of their knowledge as explicitly not school. It was based on what they learned at home. So I'm not sure. I mean, your context is slightly different. And the really interesting thing is you'll have more variability in the types of schooling that young children are exposed to in terms of the religious tradition. And so that could be something very interesting to look at.
Go ahead, John.
You're muted, John.
Still
muted.
On mute. Sorry about that. Still getting used to all these things. Yes, my question's on China. So the symbols you used for God in China is the Christian God, in particular, Shangdi. So like in the World Values Surveys and some other surveys in China, there are these different terms like God. So something that's more along the lines of Buddha, and then there's one that's more for Allah. And then there's a sort of vitalistic one. I mean, the pronunciation, I'm not good with Chinese, but it's something like Shen Ming, which is a sort of vitalistic universal energy throughout the universe that gets translated, one of the translations for God. But so the translation you used was really particularly tied to Western Christian notions of God. So that I'm wondering if you used any of these other translations and how you might expect differences amongst the children and parents whenever it's a more indigenous God concept rather than a Western God concept.
Thank you. I appreciate that question because we actually did include each of the translations that you're talking about. So the final one, and I'm not a Mandarin speaker. The way that my grad student talked about it was person in the sky. So I think that's probably similar to what you're talking about. But we also did include Buddha and ask children explicitly and parents explicitly about the existence of Buddha, only in China where the context made sense. And my memory of the data were that they were very similar to the way that those children were talking about the God translation that I showed you here. But I would have to go back and look at whether or not the relation between children's conceptions of the existence of that entity were related to the way that parents talked about them. But that's a really good point. And we spent a long time really doing a lot of translation and back translation and piloting with adults to really confirm that the concepts were, the constructs were valid across the three cultures.
No, that's really good to hear that you asked some of those other items as well, so you can refer back to them. And yeah, it's doing translation work in these areas in China and Japan is it can be very difficult. So I sympathize.
Thanks, John. Is there one last question we can take? Okay, well, let's wrap up then. So thank you again, Kathleen, for again getting up so early in the morning and joining us for this talk. And we're really looking forward to seeing more of this research start around Queen's University as well.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed sharing some of this work, and I'm excited to think with you guys in the future.
Great. Kathleen, I will stay on for a minute here if you want to as well, for a quick chat, but if you have to run,
Sure.
That's fine. That's fine too.
That's fine.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Jocelyn, do you want to stop recording?
Yes, that's a good idea. If I can figure out how, hold on.